Okay, here we go. We got it now. Okay, so we've already discussed this, but here are a couple of pictures of our kiddos. We've got 2.5 teenagers, I say, because our 10.5-year-old is fully in tween mode. Our girl down here at the bottom just graduated from high school 2 weeks ago, and we're having to check the fact that she thinks that she's an adult already. We're having to do a little bit more of that than we would prefer. And then the one over there on the left is actually here. She is taken off the last 2 days of school because they're quote unquote not doing anything. All right. So have any of y'all met Mr. Lindsay on social media? He is one of mine and Zach's favorites. He's pretty fun to watch, but he does a lot of kind of keeping up with the slang of the day. That middle school, he teaches middle school, so he sticks with those middle school kids, and we're gonna play it, and hopefully the sound will work.
I am chat clock this T because this classroom has been real Kevin lately. We got 2 weeks left of school. I need the whole chat to lock in and stop selling, or else I am cooked for real. I got a couple quick reminders for you. First off, stop touching each other, bumping into each other with your yeah, that ain't Riz, and you're not impressing your fine shite. All out here just aura farming. On God. TSPMO. Second, keep your shoes on. This is school, not a big back barefoot beach party. Walking around with your dogs out is not normal. Nobody's trying to smell toe crust during 6th hour. Phones? Nah, pack it up. Quit glazing the Italian brain rot on YouTube shorts. You're selling your whole grade for a 3-second meme. And that's buns. Don't be surprised when your GPA starts screaming, what the Sigma? Also, quit crashing out in the middle of my lessons. I ask you to take out a pencil and you're screaming, flopping around like a friggin' packet. And for the love of God, stay in the room. You left your Chromebook in your locker? Lies. I know you're out there in the hallway just saying 6, 7 to random teachers, acting like it means something, and it means nothing. And I swear on Tum 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 Sahur, if I see one more uncharged Chromebook, I will actually crash out. Bring it to school like it's a decoration and it's at 2%. What the actual hell? Let's have a good last 2 weeks.
So some of this, if you work with little kids, you might not hear much of this yet, but if you work with elementary and to middle school, definitely into high school, you're going to hear some of this complete I hate to say nonsense because some of it actually does mean stuff, but a lot of it is really just repeating things that they've heard on TikTok. They kind of, repeat different
clock this T because
memes, essentially. So one of the things that we kind of hear about, is he used the term brain rot, right? That may be a term that you've heard, maybe not, but if you haven't, you will. They kind of like to read or to even call each other out on that kind of thing. But essentially it just means, they're staring at these screens all the time and learning these words that don't mean anything. This quote, our youth love luxury. They have bad manners and despise authority. They show disrespect for their elders and love to chatter instead of exercise. Young people are now tyrants, not the servants of their household. They no longer rise when their elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up food, and terrorize their teachers. And we are about to be terrorized by 2 of our 3 dogs. So have any of you ever heard that quote before? And if so, where's it from? Do you know? All right, that was actually Socrates in 400 BCE. We are not talking about new misunderstanding or disdain for the young. This is something that we kind of always dismiss and assume that when kids are speaking, that what they're saying isn't important. Now, I'm talking to a group of people who are kid people, right? So we have a tendency maybe to more appreciate and understand that when kids are talking, that it's not a waste of time. But that doesn't mean that we always A, understand what they're saying, or B, think that we wouldn't appreciate it if they would do some things differently. I always think of my generation, I think more of like DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. Parents just don't understand, right? Like, so we're kind of more in that. It's very cliche for kids and teens to feel misunderstood, and for adults who work with kids and teens to not fully understand what they're saying or what they're doing or why. So, actually, I might get you to read this. I think I want you to be the voice of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, if you'll do it. I asked ChatGPT to answer the question, what's the deal with Gen Z, Gen Alpha? And here's what it gave me. Can you be the?
Hey, what's the tea with kids today? Why are they so extra with all the trends and the apps? Like, what's up with the obsession over social media and clout? And how do they even keep up with all the new slang and memes? It's also sus and low-key chaotic.
Right. So I laughed so hard. I was like, yeah, because my kids, my older kids especially, absolutely talk like this. They've actually started texting like this. We'll share something like in our family chat, or I'll send them something that is exciting or that they like, and I'll get an A Y Y Y Y Y Y as a response. It's A instead of wow or yay or like an exclamation point, like one of my friends might do. It's A. So keeping up with this, do y'all have a hard time keeping up with even what any of this stuff means, like when they're talking? Does anybody have a hard time? I love how you turned your camera on just to know, just to say yes. 100%.
During children's messages.
During what?
Children's messages.
Oh,
yes. I'm
Okay,
like, they answer my question with words I don't understand, so I don't know if the answer is right or not. Yeah.
You're like, yes, maybe. Like, can you translate that for me, please? So generational differences, not new. And if we are trying to kind of understand the groups that we're working with, we're trying to understand how different, I'll move that, can shoot. My notes are too small, so I'm trying to move things over a little bit. Did that change anything for y'all? A little bit? Oh, that's fine. Okay. Generational differences can are something that can be given a little bit too much credit sometimes for like the reasons why people do things or don't do things or act certain ways. But they are kind of important to understand for groups. So individually, they're not super descriptive or super helpful all the time, but they can be really helpful for kind of understanding how groups function. And generational membership does give us a pretty helpful context for kind of what people's backgrounds are and what big historical trends they might have seen versus not seen, historical events that they all lived through together, and how those things have affected them as a group. So there are very likely older members in your congregations that you have to deal with who are older than baby boomers. I mean, we're talking about kind of the greatest generation, but those are going to be our 80 plus year old members. And again, not to dismiss them, I'm sure that you have some who are probably quite influential in your congregations, but we are going to start with baby boomers. Those are generally going to be kind of the grandparents of your current youth. Some might be some younger boomers might be like they might be the main grown up for some of your kids. They might be raising grandchildren. or they might be foster parents or in some other capacity dealing with younger children. But generally, your boomers are more likely to be your grandparents and also your church leadership. They are more likely to be, your United Women in Faith folks. They're going to be your missions committee. They're going to be, the people that maybe call and say, hey, do the kids need something to do on Wednesday night? I've got a yard that needs to be raked. Or we would really love it if the kids would come down here and help finish this project that we need help with, or whatever it is. They tend to expect a level of kind of deference to authority just for being older adults from Gen Z and Gen Alpha that they are reluctant to show. Younger generations tend to not show previous generations or older adults respect in the same way that that generation was raised to show respect for their elders, just by virtue of being older. So that can be really jarring to older adults sometimes, especially if they're not used to dealing with younger people. And they kind of expect an automatic service. My mother is in this generation, and she gets very annoyed when her grandchildren don't just hop to do things, or which, don't get me wrong, so do I sometimes, especially when they are when what they're reluctant to do is kind of ridiculous. Like my mom will say, here, will you go put my bulletin in the recycling bin? And they're like, I'm not going that way. When she told me that story, my head almost exploded. I looked at them and I said, y'all, are you serious? They're like, well, I wasn't going that way. I said, well, neither was she. Your legs are younger. Take the daggum bulletin and go put it in the recycling bin. It took you 3 seconds. So that kind of thing. They don't think about it as, unless they were absolutely raised in their homes to be that way. They typically are not going to be just automatically showing that type of deference. These older groups are still going to appreciate things like mailed thank you cards and formal appreciation being shared in worship for their contributions to something. Formal invitations to events, which a lot of times we've kind of deferred to doing things on social media or emailing things out. Now, a lot of boomers, especially ones who were on the younger end that were still in the workforce when email became the main way, became a more formal means of communication, and who are smartphone users, who are competent smartphone users, they aren't bothered typically as much by that. But if you have some older boomers or people who just don't do social media, if the only way that you get the word out for something is on like a Facebook post or in a Facebook group, they won't know. They're not going to, I mean, they just don't check those things. So making sure that you, it uses formal invitations to events and requests to serve. So if you need supplies brought, or you need volunteers, only doing that in those types of spaces, often you're going to miss these folks. They also might show a limited tolerance for youth or children being outside of their designated spaces. So, they're running around, or they're being loud in the hall, or they're doing something that, that group of folks might find disrespectful to the space. Or, even as Susan mentioned in the prayer, not looking at children as future leaders, but as current, they're current members, they're current people who were involved in the church life of the church. And sometimes I think baby boomers and older might have a tendency to be less tolerant of that. Generation X is going to be our, they tend to get overlooked, which has almost become a meme about Gen X, because so millennials and baby boomers were arguing, and now Gen Z and millennials are arguing, and Gen X is just chilling. They're just kind of there in the middle. Part of it is because they're a smaller generation. They just, by numbers, are not very big. And baby boomers and millennials are huge, because baby boomers was a big generation and they were the parents of millennials. So huge, they're two bookended by two really big generations, but they're often overlooked and they tend to prefer that. They tend to kind of like to stay out of the fray. But older members of Gen X might be some of your grandparents. Um, Many are going to be parents, especially if you also work with teenagers. So you might have some of those graduating, 11th, 12th graders, or if you've got families that have, you've got their youngest kid, and they've got older kids, that you might still have some Gen X. Zach and I actually kind of are on either side of that divide. So he was born in 79, I was born in 81. So he likes to throw the term millennial around a lot when I do something that he finds funny. He'll say, okay, millennial. I'm like, dude, you're 2 years older than me. But he will be like, well, I'm not a millennial. But I actually I feel a little bit more drawn to that micro generation that's in the Oregon Trail generation is sometimes how it's referred. And these are folks who kind of, the Gen X and millennials, they have had an uneasy partnership, partially united against, I hate to say against, in trying to get baby boomers to retire to make space for them, because baby boomers have kind of held on to leadership positions for longer than has allowed Gen X to kind of grow into those positions. They are, though, now finally getting to the point where a lot of your church leadership might be in Gen X. They might be older millennials as well, depending on, obviously their ages. But they have a lot of characteristics that I kind of think of as middle children. There's a broad feeling of invisibility, and they were often raised to be kind of independent. So we had a lot of latchkey kids in this generation. So they were unsupervised for a lot of their childhood, and given a lot of room to explore, a lot of kind of being on their own or in groups of kids who were the same age. And they weren't raised with digital technology. So they might have had video games, but beyond that, they didn't really have a lot of that. And it was like a lot of going to the arcade if they wanted to do that kind of thing. And then, but the internet became widely available when they were kind of starting to raise families. So it's more of they had to kind of take it on as part of adulthood, where when we get into the micro generations and then into millennials, the internet kind of came along more when they were younger. So again, the Oregon Trail generation, we remember a life before the internet. And then we remember the internet becoming a thing. And then we remember, when instant messaging was a thing. And then so we kind of grew up with the technology and all the changes of the technology. So we might have had a favorite album on cassette and then on CD and then on MP3 and then on Apple Music. And now we might have it on vinyl. So we've kind of done all the things. Millennials are going to make up the majority of your parents, especially if of your middle school and older parents. They are often still mistakenly referred to as the young people. So millennials are doing the following things. Well, millennials are in their 30s and 40s. So we're not talking about, they are not the youngins anymore, regardless of how much that terminology gets thrown around. So then they've been labeled lazy, whiny, entitled, all the stuff, just like Socrates said, 2,400 years ago. They are a very large generation and were raised with digital technology. And those oldest millennials are the ones who first got access to the internet before leaving home. But we've also experienced a lot of financial trouble, a lot of these kind of big financial impacts in the broader culture that have impacted access to employment, home ownership, building wealth, student loan debt. And then a lot of these things have hit at times when we were doing big things. So 2008 financial crisis hit when a lot of millennials were graduating from college and entering the workforce. The COVID hit when a lot of millennials had young children. So a lot of these things have had a huge impact and slowed down the trajectories of millennials in ways that um, have had huge impacts on family dynamics and other aspects of living. We tend to have higher rates of debt relative to other generations. The Zennials with a Z, those are kind of the millennial Gen Z cuspers. And like they probably don't, let's say, like Skibbity Toilet or Riz, but they grew up on social media. And these might be your young parents. So these might be the ones, if you deal with like preschool, kindergarten, and early elementary folks, these might be your young parents. Gen Z is going to be the majority of your youth group for older ones. And for those of you who deal with or have been in ministry for like less than 10 years, you've never worked with anybody else. You didn't have any millennials. You only have had Gen Z. The rest of your folks, so those of you who are in, children's ministry only and don't do any middle school or above, they are Gen Alpha. And so that's who we're going to talk about for the rest of our time together. So we've kind of talked about who their parents and grandparents are. What do you hear in the media or from other adults, especially those who do not work with children, and from these kids' parents? What do you hear about them, about Gen Z and about Gen Alpha? What do you hear about them?
Constantly on their phones, don't have a difficult time just talking to other people.
Okay.
Don't know how to converse or that type of thing, but
Okay.
constantly on their phones.
Yeah, constantly on their phones. What else?
I've heard a lot, not so much from our youth group parents, but more from my friends who have kids in this age group, particularly around how there's no safe space for them anymore because of the phone, because of that connectivity to social media, and because of like, even if the family has boundaries or regulations around it, then their kid is missing out because they're not on TikTok at 9 o'clock with all their friends or in the group chat or whatever. But it's also just there's no safe haven for them because they're just it's constantly running like a loop in their brain of like, I'm missing out. What are my friends talking about that I'm not a part of, or they're being bullied, or like the bullying seems to have increased dramatically in this. And so that's one thing that I hear around like the phones and social media, especially. But I also hear like a lot about how the anxiety rates have increased. And like they feel like they have to know what they're going to be doing with the rest of their lives. And I know that we all experienced that at that age too, but I feel like it's a lot different with the Gen Z, especially of like, there's just all this pressure that if you didn't start in football at 5 years old, you can't play football in college. And it's like, what happened?
Yes.
So I think there's a lot of that. And I see that in our youth group kids of like the Maysember. Is that the phrase everybody calls this Maysember? And like, it is so strong because like they've got their dive competitions and their dance performances and graduation and like all this stuff is going on, and their anxiety levels are just like through the roof. And it feels like all year long, our parents were like, they're stretched so thin, they're so stressed out, they're so busy, they have so much going on. And I think like their engagement in activities and extracurriculars and things have drastically increased compared to
100%.
even 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yeah. 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 Those are, we're actually going to talk about several of those things. Yeah. 100%. Anybody else have anything they want to add before we go on? A lot of these stereotypes, you can kind of go back to Socrates, and we're dealing with just stereotypes of the young, right? So these are not necessarily unique to Gen Z, Gen Alpha. These are just things that parents just don't understand. The older adults have forgotten that they too were like this. They have forgotten that their parents thought the same things of them that they are now thinking of their own children. One of the major differences, though, is our media environment. So even though, yes, Socrates thought these things, Socrates would have had to have, a town crier stand in the public square and tell him the things that were going on. And or had a messenger bring him a papyrus scroll. I don't know. I'm making that part up, but slow moving communication, right? Now we are 24-hour news cycle that started when millennials were teenagers, but has only sped up and expanded. So talking about having the media following you around and feeling like you're missing out. Adults do it too, but we tend to do it about the news or about, what our work email was in our work email or, other things. Not to say that adults don't also do that with social media, but we have infinite outlets that need infinite content to fill technically the same 24 hours, but we're multiplying that 24 hours by however many content creators there are. And they all have to do things that drive engagement. So whatever they're coming up with has to be something that people will want to click on, whatever article it is, whatever reel it is, whatever TikTok it is. And so outrage and other big feelings are what drives engagement. So when somebody posts a news article that is titled Gen Z or Gen Alpha, fill in the blank, is more entitled than any previous generation, and that's what you already think, you're going to click on it and say, yeah. And then you're going to read it and comment and say, yeah, that's what I thought too. And really, all of these articles are recycled. Every new generation, we see the same stuff about the same things. Most of these stereotypes come from employers. So as Gen Z graduates and has entered the workforce, a lot of these stereotypes are coming from employers. And then a lot of the stereotypes of younger folks come from parents and teachers because they're the ones who obviously interact with these kids more often. You can literally read examples of news stories back to the turn of the last century, talking about how young people aren't as productive as older generations, who are, of course, the ones who are writing these pieces. And that's the same now. They're the ones who are the content creators. And so these parents who get on and talk about how lazy and narcissistic and, frivolous and materialistic, whatever, that their own kids are, it's just the same cycle over and over again. Smartphones do make all of this different. And having that kind of constant barrage of information, our brains were really just not formed to take in the just sheer amount of information that we're kind of constantly fed. It is not the same. It is the same and not the same as when, we were kids who were addicted to the boob tube. We were constantly watching the MTV, or whatever it was, whatever older adults were griping about at that time. And back farther, that they sit and listen to the radio all the time. Like, it's every new technology is going to have this, but AI and smartphones do actually make this a little bit different. We had limited access to a lot of these things, and now it's just everywhere. So these stereotypes often grow from a grain of truth, and these Gen Z and Gen Alpha stereotypes are based on the perceptions of older generations, just like everything else. But we can also put a positive spin on some of these things. So a sense of what older adults might see as a sense of entitlement, it might be more that these kids know their worth and they know that they are worthy. And so not putting up with people's crap, for lack of a better term. I mean, earning respect is something that I think most people can agree on. And so assuming that you're going to be shown respect just because you exist and are older than this child, but then treat them terribly, I kind of get it. A lack of loyalty could be an unwillingness to accept poor treatment. So Gen Z, especially as they've entered the workforce, they're more willing to leave jobs than previous generations are. younger people are more willing to leave activities or complain about teachers or not want to participate in something when they are treated badly. Being frivolous could be finding joy in small things. Narcissistic, they were raised to share their lives online. So it can look as being self-centered, but they have always been raised to share everything. Lacking work ethic. These ended up not lined up. Lacking work ethic, willingness to take time for their needs. I'm willing to take my vacation days. My parents didn't take their vacation days. I'm willing to take my vacation days. Poor mental health. They were raised to discuss mental health. So we're still not sure, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, but we're still not quite sure whether we actually have as much of a mental health crisis as it is perceived, because people just are willing to talk about it more. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then tech obsessed, they were born into a tech saturated environment. And yes, they genuinely do have shorter attention spans, but they were raised in front of screens. They were raised with short clips of things. So yeah, their attention spans are short. So some of the things that we're going to talk about just about how this generation is the way that they are. One of the things is safetyism and overparenting. So they've broadly been given too much supervision and not enough responsibility. So millennial parents were themselves overparented, and these older Gen Z parents were also overparented. They were given less freedom than their boomer parents. That's one of the outcomes of this 24-hour news cycle. Parents got scared. They started seeing stuff in real time, Amber Alerts and things like that, which are fantastic. But you didn't have to wait until the next day to see the newspaper that something happened. You find out moments after it happened. So this generation of teens and kids has largely been inside and supervised by adults at all times. And then keeping up with the Joneses has led to, and fearful parenting has kind of led parents to make sure that their kids get to do everything that they want to do. And, but really only in the realm of like scheduled activities. So they're not going to be out riding their bike. They're going to be in this league and that league, and being carted around by their parents. They have had a lot fewer opportunities to get hurt and get dirty, and to kind of build the resilience that our bodies and brains need to be hardwired to take risks. And those risks don't have to be big risks. They can be just, I'm willing to walk across the street and ask a question, and not assume that I'm going to die. And parents have been reluctant to allow kids to do that. This generation of parents has been expected to be constantly parenting at all times, 24 hours a day. And the village that had been available for previous generations has shrunk. So you're not going to parent your neighbor's kids, and your neighbors are not going to parent your kids. And while there are probably some pluses to that, there are a lot more drawbacks to that than positives. So parents are really tired and they're scared, and there's kind of no end in sight. Like if you are one who's willing to let your kid cross the street and ask a quote unquote stranger a question, then you're viewed as, you did what? Why did you let them do that? So we've got fewer opportunities to do things like recreational activities that are free or low cost. We don't have pickup games in the street. You have to be in a league. And if you want to play football in college, you have to start playing when you're 5. And that is bad for kids, and it's bad for parents. And honestly, it's bad for teams, because you end up missing out probably on a lot of talent that you would have access to. School has become so politicized and not often developmentally not appropriate. So just at a high level, going on we all see what's going on in schools. School environment, we're including things like book bans, preparing for gun violence. So, I mean, these kids start from the time they start school, things like intruder drills, and, preparing for those things. And then just like a constant implementation of changes that it's often not understood why things are changing. So they might have had one curriculum where they started learning math a certain way, and then the very next year there might be a different curriculum, and they don't necessarily always go together. And the teachers are often not the ones making the decisions. So they're subject to rules made by people who have political motives and not people who have their best interest or even an understanding of development at heart of those decisions. Teachers are highly stressed, and they often can't teach using developmentally appropriate practices that they know. So if we're talking about elementary school kids, they are often, made to sit for longer periods of time than what's developmentally appropriate, even if their teachers know that that's not what they should be doing, but they have so much stuff that they have to cover, or they have to add things into the classroom that maybe the teachers aren't really the best ones to be sharing that information or the best ones to be implementing that, but they don't have another option because it was mandated in some way, shape, or form. Peers and social development. Why don't kids want to drive? And why are they only hanging out online? So while most of you might work with younger kids, this trend is not probably in danger of ending anytime soon. So kind of preparing for as they get a little bit older. Kids are dating less, and they're also dating later. They tend to do a lot of group activities, which honestly is great. But they also tend to be less comfortable going, and doing something with just one other person. And they tend to do things that are online. Kids are less interested in getting their driver's licenses as soon as they're available. Is the driving age in Michigan 16 or is it 18 in Michigan? 16. So it is in Arkansas as well. And like our daughter who's about to be 15 couldn't care less. Like I finally just told her we've got to start practicing, or by the time you do want to drive, you're not going to know how. So we're going to have to start practicing. But fewer kids are driving. But part of that is because they also didn't ride bikes, and they also didn't do anything where they were independent. They don't know how to get places. Their parents have always taken them. So there's kind of a lack of comfort with that level of freedom for a lot of kids. More peer interactions are going to take place in those digital spaces. That's not all bad. I think sometimes that's made to be viewed as all bad. It doesn't have to be. Negative peer interactions, kind of as we mentioned before, can follow kids home. And that isn't something that previous generations typically had to deal with. You could unplug your phone if you had a kid who kept, prank calling you or calling and being mean. But they really can't escape it unless they're, willing to give up their phone or their parents are willing to take it. They just kind of have the entire world of stuff that can be purchased and influence them to purchase it at their fingertips all the time. So it makes it to where they're less likely to feel kind of content with what they have because they can see all the stuff that other people have. They do still hang out with others in person. They're, at least in my experience and what the research shows, is that perception that kids never hang out in person is a little bit overblown. And my kids are on the phone with their friends all the time, just like I was. They just are on FaceTime. And so they'll have like a big FaceTime group chat where they're all talking, or it'll just be one or two of them together and they're doing their homework together, just like I did with my friends. But they'll have their phone sitting on, and their poor friends, if they were to look at their screen, they're literally looking at the ceiling. But when they do want to talk, they're there. Mental health. So one of the questions that gets asked a lot is, why does every kid suddenly have anxiety? Or why are so many kids going to the hospital for suicidal thoughts or behaviors? And then the Anxious Generation book, if you've read it or heard about it, kind of blew up this conversation in some positive and, in my opinion, also some negative ways. The Surgeon General under Biden issued a report about the teen mental health crisis. Statistics show higher rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation among Gen Z than among previous generations. And it appears that that trend is going to continue. There are lots of indications that teens are struggling with their mental health. That's not, that part isn't necessarily overblown. But statistics support the idea that it is indeed worse than in the past, but that there are lots of factors that we should probably take into account. Not the least of which is that people, including parents, are more likely to seek help for these kids. Historically, we would have had maybe a kid who conducted or in who engaged in self-harm or who had suicidal thoughts, but maybe didn't tell anybody or told their parents and they said, we don't talk about that. Or the parents just didn't know what to do. And so kids are much more likely to tell each other and their parents that they're struggling in a way that previous generations didn't really do. And so more kids being admitted into the hospital would be kind of a natural outgrowth of that increased willingness to talk about it. It also is more likely to be covered by insurance now than historically. So after the Affordable Care Act was implemented, insurance companies had to cover mental health in ways that previously they didn't. And so that's another factor that we have to take into consideration, because even if parents had wanted to take their kids to the hospital, they might not have been able to afford to. Phones are definitely a factor, but they aren't the only factor. And I think if you've read The Anxious Generation or have heard about it, it is a good book and it has some really good ideas, but it is not going to take care of all the things. And a lot of what it is, what is being focused on out of it, I would argue is not even most of what he suggested we do. So we're having to start using phone pouches in our school district. Our 10-and-a-half-year-old doesn't have a phone, but she did ask me, do you know what a Yonder pouch is? And I was like, yes. Just kind of had to leave it at that. But she doesn't have a phone anyway, so we don't have to worry about it. But we will have to worry about it in the future. Other influences are going to be things like these kids, especially those younger ones that you might be dealing with. Some of them were born during COVID. And if they weren't born during COVID, they were real little. Our youngest daughter had to finish her pre-K year. She turned 5 in October of 2019 and then finished up pre-K at home. So these kids, the older kids were in like elementary and middle school when COVID hit. And then the younger ones were, as I said, born or in preschool or early elementary. The precautions affected kids differently. Ones who, like our oldest daughter has some health anxiety. Like has a little, I would say she's a little bit of a hypochondriac. So she was kind of prepared because she just knew something like this was going to happen. But also, she was not playing around with it. She was not going to be around people. She was not going to do anything. But some families took those precautions real seriously. Others did not. And kids may have also lost family members. They might have lost friends. They might have lost teachers. And almost all of them are behind academically and socially. They went to school with half their faces covered, which for safety's sake was great. But my middle school daughter, who was, she finished 7th grade and then started 8th grade in COVID, she would come home and say stuff like, I think this boy's really cute, but I can't see the bottom of his face. And so like she didn't want to take the chance that he wasn't actually as cute as she thought. AI is everywhere. This generation is having to learn how to navigate AI. They will be the first to misuse it, just like everything else. But for adults dealing with this generation, it's going to be important that they learn how to use AI as a tool and to use it safely, and also to recognize when it is being used, so that they don't, start paying attention to things that are like unrealistic body ideals or unrealistic ideas of artistic talent or things that, AI can do in ways that humans cannot. So it's going to be really important skill for them to develop. And then shrinking attention spans. We've got our kids who they see a squirrel and off they go. Some of that is completely normal behavior for little kids. You don't want they can't focus. Their brains genuinely are not capable. But they have no patience for things like advertising. But why would they? They've never had to watch it. They've always been able to watch things on demand. Some kids are better than others at finding things that can kind of make their brains feel better and help them learn how to focus, and others are not. So what are these kids going to expect from y'all? What do they expect from y'all? They expect inclusion. They expect respect for themselves as individuals. And then their bodies and for their opinions. And they also expect honesty, transparency. They expect it to be able to provide their input, and they expect the adults in their lives to be held accountable. And then what we often give them, though, is overreaction, overcorrection, and dismissal, and belittling, and that kind of do as I say, not as I do.